warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We, as a group, consists of three. My name is Novia Shofah as the first speaker, Diah Pitaloka as the second speaker, and Kekeh Dwita as the third. So for today, we'd like to present our research entitled Islamic and Civilized, Refusals of Other Sudanese Portrayed in the Museum, written by Leila Aboulela. We are coming from the same university, UINSA Sunan Ampel, Surabaya, Faculty of Adab and Humanities. Okay. A Sudanese woman named Shadia is described as Islamic and civilized in a short story entitled The Museum. Shadia shows herself as a Muslim who migrated from Sudan to Scotland and is described as a civilized Muslim. There are indications that the short story has implicit messages showing refusals to the other Sudanese as a third world country. Therefore, the study aims to describe how the refusals of other Sudanese is seen through Islamic women and civilized Sudan, which is more civilized than Scotland. This research studies postcolonialism from Edward Said perspective because it discusses the labels given to Eastern and Western countries. The results of this study shows that Shadia as a Sudanese woman and Muslim can strengthen Islamic principles as an aspect of majesty and civilization. Also able to express her opinion as an independent Muslim woman who refused European-centric understanding as the other, as the Aryan, savage, and primitive. The Islamic context can be found in literary works through the characters depicted and the stories told in the narrative. The controversy between Islam and Western countries makes the Islamic context in literature widely discussed. The critical relationship between Islam and Western countries arises because Islam shows significant developments and makes it a different construct from the West. Literary works that describe the Islamic context with a postcolonial background are an attempt by Muslim and non-Muslim writers to explain the experiences of Muslims in the modern world. This, for example, can be seen in the choice of a Muslim woman who chooses not to wear a headscarf or hijab while in a Western country. As is well known, the veil or hijab will never have a neutral meaning and exists without partiality because the veil in modern times is not only meant as a symbol of Islam but also symbolized as a contrast. Therefore, many Muslim women still wear hijab or veil even though they live in Western countries. This was also shown by the author of a Muslim literary work named Leila Aboulela in her short story entitled The Museum. The Museum is one of the short stories by Leila Aboulela in her collection of books entitled Colorful Lights. The story of the museum begins with the narration of a Muslim Sudanese woman named Shadia who is studying in Scotland. From the narrative of the short story, it seems that Leila Aboulela implicitly conveys to the reader that Shadia is a Muslim woman who always wears a hijab or veil during her activities outside the room. This raises an indication of religious devotion that is attached to Shadia even though she is living in a Western country. This is interesting to study because religious observance in non-Islamic countries is full of challenges and conflicts. The conflict within the museum is when Shadia struggles to adapt to Scotland. Differences in climate, culture, history, and religion are threatening for Shadia. Until one day, Shadia worked up the courage to communicate with Brian, a student from the Great Britain. Many things made Shadia really angry, rebellious, and full of rejection after knowing Brian. But first, Brian's selection of fashion is typical with a Western image, accessories and hairstyles that do not reflect advanced civilization. And then the misrepresentation of African history by Western, namely Africa, is described as full of wilderness, while Africa has high buildings. And then the third one, and the fourth, the wrong perception of Western is towards to Eastern. Islam is described as a scary religion and then weak in the economy, undeveloped education, wild and dangerous and ancient civilizations. Meanwhile, Leila Aboulela describes the Shadia family in the museum who are economically successful and advanced in education. This invites Shadia's rejections whenever she interacted with Brian. The term Orientalism, an important thought by Edward Said, is used to explain how the perspective or stereotype of the Aryan or East is formulated by Western writers with the stigma of Easterns as criminals and everything that is bad. Negative stigma is attached to Eastern based on various sources like colonial government documents, historical evidence, religious studies, language, and then the travel notes and others. Therefore, Orientalism is a real form of Western power over the East by showing dominance over inequality. This then encourages and convinces Easterns that accepting Western culture is an effort to become civilized, to become correct, standardized. The other, the group inhabited by Eastern society, is described by its characteristics as barbaric, rebellious, cruel, marginalized, and primitive. And this is in stark really contrast to the Occidental. There are several literature reviews that also use the same short story, The Museum. For the first, it comes from the issues of cross-cultural understanding, dislocation, depression, alienation, and so on. And then the researcher used the psychological state of the characters, used the psychosocial theory. And the second literature review talked about the Islamic aspects in two of Aboulela's short stories, The Museum and Visitors. And then the third one talked about the issue of violence behind European-centric understanding, and then using the comparative literature method. And then the fourth one talk about or discuss about the decolonization of the short story, The Museum, but using the discourse analysis. Although some literary views have the same material object as this research, the theory or formal object use differs. This study uses the concept of Orientalism from the perspective of Edward Said to describe the rejections or refusals of Sudan's otherness as shown through the Islamization inherent in Shadia and the advanced civilization in Sudan. Because of this, it is important to conduct this research to find out how Shadia aggressively shows her opinion every time she confronts to Brian, a Western, through Edward Said theory of post-colonialism from the perspective of Orientalism. This research is descriptive qualitative research by explaining the issues in the research data. In the process, the researcher understands the object of the study by describing the data in a complex and detailed manner. This research method is often used in literary studies because it aims to make it easier for readers to understand something being studied. The data source in this research is the short story The Museum by Leila Aboulela in a collection of short stories entitled Colored Lights. The data of the study are words, phrases, and sentences that show the rejection of otherness towards Sudan by a Muslim woman character named Shadia in the short story The Museum. The analysis technique for this research is by studying the literature through various sources such as books, journal articles, theses, dissertation, and other reading sources. And then for the next, will be presented by Diah Pitaloka.
So this is the results and discussions. According to combat the brutality of Westerners in presenting the states of Africa, Sadia used a variety of techniques. Despite popular belief, Africa contains skyscrapers similar to those found in large cities. African bedrooms also have good facades, according to the text. Contrary to how the West perceives them, Africans are technologically literate and not as in the past as they appear to be. Next, from a historical perspective, we know the Westerns are frequently stereotyped as possessing manners and behaving in a socially acceptable way. The little anecdote does, however, show how close-minded Westerners can be. The Eastern, on the other hand, desire to interact with one another socially, and world history has been portrayed by the West in a wholly inaccurate way. The next, we can see in this text, Sadia's persona upholds the ideal of a powerful Muslim woman. Sadia may be an immigrant living in a Western nation, but she still has recollection of her village and the call to prayer. We know in Western, no call to prayer resounds in the morning because Western civilization does not acknowledge the call to praise Muslims. The next, according to Hudson, there isn't much a physical barrier dividing the West and the East. The narrative does, however, depict Westerners engaging in oppressive behavior. Sadia disagrees with the other people's dominant European centricity. Additionally, Sadia contends that the West is not the center of global power. And the next, the Western stereotype that Africa is an underdeveloped continent is one that Sadia denies in the text. Like in the West, luxury employment is also available to Africans. Based on the text, Sadia rejects a Western approach. The conclusion, this research is a study of post-colonialism from Edward Said's perspective because it discusses the levels attached to countries with Eastern and Western strongholds. The results of the study indicate that Sadia, as a Sudanese Muslim, is able to maintain Islamic principle as an aspect of nobility and civilization, and is able to voice her opinion as an independent Muslim woman who rejects European-centric understanding the other, the Orient, savage, and primitive. So this is our analysis about the museum short story by Leila Aboulela. Thank you for listening. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.